Thank you for coming to vibe with me. This is Adult Bedtime Stories. We are finally reading Chapter 5, The Gods Who Loved Women of The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. This is the first book that we ever read on Adult Bedtime Stories. Yeah, we've gotten a lot further in the other books. Ironic, huh? So, we're going to get right into it. The word of the day is seek. Sought, seeking. 1. To try to find, search for. 2. To try to get. 3. To aim at. 4. To try, attempt. To seek, to please. Seeker. That's it. Alright, Secret History of the World by Mark Booth. Chapter 5, The Gods Who Love Women. The Nephilim, the genetic engineering of humankind, the fish gods, the original history of the origin of the species. We are now about to look into one of the murkier and more shameful episodes in the history of the world. Even within secret societies, a veil is sometimes drawn. A priest in Babylon at the time of Alexander the Great was one of the first historians. It is clear from the few remaining fragments that Berosus, like Herodotus before him, had studied the king lists inscribed on temple walls, and delved into the secret priestly archives. The fragments that survive contain teachings on the history of the origins of the earth and sky, and of the race of the hermaphrodites, the pre-sexual humans who produced by means of parthenogenesis. Berosus goes on to describe how the land came to be inhabited by a primitive race. Then one day, he says, a monster emerged on the seashore, an animal called Awanes, whose whole body was that of a fish. Under the fish's head he had another head, with feet also below similar to those of a man, subjoined to the fish's tail. His voice and language were articulate and human, and representation of him is preserved even to this day. This monster was accustomed to pass the day among men, but took no food then, and he gave them an insight into letters and science and art of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could soften manners and humanize their lives. And when the sun had set, this being Awanes retired again into the sea, and passed the night in the sea, for he was amphibious. After this appeared other animals like Awanes. Similar stories of fish gods who suddenly appear and become the teachers of mankind can be found in other traditions. For example, the Indian stories about Matsya, the first avatar of Vishnu, and the stories of the ancient Phoenicians of the Dagon who taught Dagon tribe in West Africa. We even know from Plutarch that the earliest representations of Zeus were of a man with a fish tail, an image which survived in Greek mythology in the form of his brother Poseidon. Some modern writers outside the esoteric tradition have seen in this fish imagery evidence of an alien invasion in ancient times. It's even been suggested that the human race was genetically engineered by alien invaders, which is a good illustration of the way that esoteric traditions are misinterpreted by people who impose a materialistic gloss on them. If our candidate for initiation had been initiated to a high enough level, he would have been taught the truth of the matter, something very like the following. In Genesis, there is a passage which may at first not seem to refer to the same fishy events, though it is also about invasion by beings from another realm. Genesis 6:1-5.
And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took wives which they chose when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually.
What on earth are we to make of this passage? The phrase here translated as sons of God is elsewhere in the Bible a phrase used to mean angels, messengers coming down from heaven. But in this context, coming down also seems to carry with it moral opprobrium. By saying that the angels had sex with women in Genesis, perhaps saying that these angels loved themselves to participate in the material world, and perhaps they had become too enamored with it. As I say, we are now trying to penetrate one of the murkier episodes in the secret history, and these 5 verses in Genesis might well remain completely impenetrable were it not for the fact that this episode is treated rather more fully in ancient Hebrew traditions, particularly the
Book of Enoch.
This book disappeared from mainstream exoteric history in AD 300 to 400, but traditions regarding its existence, its contents, and teachings were preserved in Freemasonry. Then in 1773, some very tattered scripts of it were tracked down in Ethiopian monasteries by the Scottish explorer James Bruce, and in this way the old Freemasonic traditions were vindicated. Never part of the canon of Christian scripture, as it was put together in the 4th century, the Book of Enoch was nevertheless sufficiently esteemed by writers of the New Testament for them to quote from it, evidently viewing it as an authority with a status something like sacred scripture. It is a measure of the status of this book that Jesus Christ evidently recognized its notions of a coming kingdom and the judgment of the world. Moreover, the phrase used at his transfiguration, "This is my son, the elect one," is meant to show that Jesus Christ is the one promised by the Book of Enoch. This is what the Book of Enoch has to say about the angels who loved women. Enoch 6:1-4. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels of the children of heaven saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose ourselves wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and they became pregnant. Later, Enoch is given a tour of the heavens, where the rebel angels or watchers ask Enoch to intercede with God on their behalf. But when Enoch tries to do so, God only repudiates them, sending Enoch back. And go say to the watchers who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. The story of the rebellious angels is then retold, as it were, in God's own words and with additional details. Enoch 6:15-16.
Therefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of the earth, and begotten giants as your sons. And though you are spiritual beings living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and blood as those also who die and perish. And now as to the watchers who have sent thee to intercede for them, who have been aforetime in heaven, say to them, You have been in heaven, but all the mysteries had not yet been revealed to you, and you knew worthless ones, and these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to women, and through these mysteries women and men work much evil on earth. Say to them, therefore, you have no peace.
The Epistle of Jude 6:6 describes the watchers as having not kept their own appointed habitations. A 3rd century Christian writer, Commodianus, wrote, The women who seduced the angels were of such lewdness that their seducers could not now desire to return to heaven. But beyond these few strange fragmentary hints lies a set of characters very familiar to us all. When the Epistle to Jude describes the watchers as not having kept to their appointed seasons, it seems to be referring to them in some way as timekeepers. But the final telling clues to reveal the hidden identity of these fallen angels lies in their numbers, given in one of the versions of the Book of Enoch as 7. In all traditions, 7 is the number of the great gods of the solar system. Again, we see that the biblical narrative has encoded within its stories the same astronomical gods as those of Greece and Rome. The angels who became sexually attracted to human women are none other than the gods of Olympus. We have seen that the Bible contains encoded within it the account of creation in which key roles have been played by Saturn, Earth, the Sun, Venus, and the Moon. We have followed the story from the purely material to the vegetable to the first stirrings of animal life. The age that followed would be marked by the arrival of gods of the solar system. Jupiter, Zeus, as he was known to the Greeks, became the king of all the gods. The gods of Mars and Mercury would fly into view during this age too. The infant Jupiter had to be hidden from his father, Saturn. Mother Earth kept Jupiter on the island of Crete, in a cave deep underground, isolated from the other gods. Jupiter lived on the milk of a goat nymph and ate the honey of sacred bees. Mother Earth hid Jupiter in this cave because she was afraid that Saturn and the Titans, the elder sons and daughters of Saturn, would come to destroy him. She knew that the birth of Jupiter showed that the reign of Saturn was coming to an end, but the transformation from one age to another is always a painful one. The old order always tries to stay on beyond its allotted time. The Titans were Saturn's enforcers. They were the consciousness eaters. They wanted to swallow up the new life and create what Milton, who knew all about this secret history, called a universe of death. The Titans would always be the enemies of Jupiter. They failed to kill him while he was still an infant, But they did not cease to wage war on him, sporadically and in great battles, until finally and decisively Jupiter defeated them and imprisoned them underground. There these great forces of materialism became part of the very structure of the earth, and whenever volcanoes rumbled and threatened to erupt, the ancients heard their discontent. With the Titans in prison, Jupiter became for a while the undisputed ruler of Mount Olympus, king of the gods and god of a new age. He shook his magnificent locks, and the whole earth trembled. He was the only god strong enough to throw the thunderbolt. In his masterpiece, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, the great Italian scholar and writer Roberto Calasso, who has done much to bring esoteric lore regarding the historical reality behind myths to a wide public, put it like this: Olympus is a rebellion of lightness against precision. In other words, the Olympic gods, Jupiter, Apollo, Mars, Mercury, Diana, Athena, and the others, rebelled against the limitations imposed by Saturn. The Olympians flew through the air to perform magical deeds and defeat terrible monsters. It was a splendid, spectacular era that thrashes and writhes in the mind, inspiring some of history's most imaginative art, sculpture, and literature. But it was also somewhat sinister, an age charged with moral ambiguity. The thunderbolt of Jupiter struck through a dense fog of testosterone, the feral reek of animal passion, the fell heartlessness of animal ferocity. Jupiter raped Callisto, and she was turned into a bear. He raped Io, turning her into a cow. He punished Lycaon for cannibalism by turning him into a wolf. Apollo's lust for Hyacinth caused the beautiful youth to metamorphose into the flower, and his rape of Daphne ended in her morphing into the laurel bush. We should take note that all these myths are concerned with is the proliferation of natural forms, the cramming of every square inch of our planet with the almost infinite variety of plants and animals, the biodiversity that it is great natural glory. Zeus is not moral in a sense that Moses would have recognized, but he and his fellow Olympians direct the galvanizing, the maraud creativity of the biological world. But what of the story of the fish gods? How does that fit in? We have seen that many mythologies around the world tell the strange story of the arrival of the fish gods, and we have touched on the fact that even Jupiter, in his earliest representations, was one of them. We have seen, too, that the myths of Jupiter and the other Olympian gods are an account of the proliferation of animal forms. Bringing these two things together gives rise to an astonishing possibility. Could it be that the ancient myths anticipated the modern scientific insight that the animal life that would eventually evolve into the human form began life as a fish? If this were true, it would be an astonishing revelation. Darwin's discovery of the evolution of the species is one of history's great scientific discoveries, ranked alongside Galileo's, Newton's, and Einstein's. Could it be that the priests of the mystery schools knew of the evolution of species many thousands of years earlier? We shall now discover how evidence for this claim, which may initially at least sound implausible, is written across the sky in blazing lights for all to see. We are crackling the code of the cosmos. We saw how the earliest episodes in history are to be understood in terms of the ordered creation of the solar system. One after the other, Saturn, the Sun, Venus, and the Moon, and Jupiter joined in the work of weaving together the basic conditions that made possible the evolution of life on Earth. Following this sequence has brought us to the dawn of animal life and of consciousness, and the beginning of the proliferation of animal forms. In order to understand the history of the development of these animal forms, we must turn again to astronomy, and following on from the sequence in which the ancients believed the planets were created, we now turn to an interlocking sequence, the constellations of the zodiac. To ancients, the forces of nature were asleep during winter and then reawakened, exerting their influence anew in the spring. The constellation in which the sun rose in the spring was therefore very important to them. The sun vivified that constellation, energizing it and increasing its power to shape the world and its history. Because of a slight wobble in the earth as it spins on its axis, the sun seems to us to fall slowly backwards against the backdrop of stars. Over a period of some 2,160 years, the sun rises in the same constellation. It then moves on to the next one. We are currently in the age of Pisces and famously awaiting the dawn of the age of Aquarius. As constellation follows constellation and age follows age, the symphonic variations of the music of the spheres signal a new movement. The cycle of animating powers of instinctual drives sweeping through the cosmos moves on to a new plane, We think of the 12 constellations of the zodiac following in a sequence according to months of the year. Aries follows by Taurus, the Gemini, in larger cycle measured by the appearances of these constellations at the spring equinox. The constellations move backwards. Gemini is followed by Taurus, then Aries, and so on. This phenomenon is known as precession. There is some dispute among academics as to when the ancients first became aware of it. The breakthrough book on this subject was Hamlet's Mill, written by Giorgio de Santillana, MIT professor of the history and philosophy of science, and Hertha von Deschand, professor of science at Frankfurt University, and published in 1969. Tremendously erudite, it began a process of rediscovering an astronomical dimension of myths that had long been forgotten outside the secret societies. Their thesis is that one of the stories central to all mythology, indeed all literature, from Oedipus Rex to Hamlet, the story of the dispossessed son who defeats his uncle to regain his father's throne, is a description of an astronomical event, one processional epoch succeeding another, but Hamlet's Mill provides an essentially static model. It shows that precision is encoded on one particular archetype, not how the succession of ruling constellations allows us to see different layers of myth in their proper chronological sequence. Let us now look at this sequence in terms of the historical reality that lies beyond the myth of Jupiter and the other gods according the esoteric tradition. Because we have been looking at history as it has been remembered in myths, particularly the myths of gods of Olympus, we have naturally been picturing to ourselves anatomically modern humans. However, we should continue to bear in mind that these myths represent what these things would have looked like to the eye of the imagination. But to a physical eye, and if any such had existed, it would all have looked very different. Because what these imaginative pictures represent is the beginning and development of primitive life forms. If the age of the first marine life was marked by the rulership of the planet Jupiter, then in terms of the precision of the constellations, it was marked by Pisces. When the sun first began to rise in the constellation of Pisces, a new form condensed out of the semi-liquid substance on the Earth's surface. This was the earliest embryonic form of the fish, somewhat like a modern jellyfish. The ancients, convinced of this evolutionary impulse as a god, if primitive life on Earth, the life that would eventually evolve into human life, took on a primitive fish-like form, that was because a god took on this form first, and as it were pulled life on Earth with him. In Egypt, this miraculous event, the birth of animal life, was known as the birth of Horus, and the earliest representations of Horus, like those of Jupiter, were half man, half fish. The lantern of Osiris is an ancient record of this late vegetable protuberance from the animal form. And there's a picture. There you are. I got high all by myself. I don't smoke, no one else. Let's get back to it. So we again see that the Greeks and Egyptians, like the Greeks and the Hebrews, worshiped the same god in different cultural clothing. The next precessional age was the first stage of Aquarius. This was the era of the evolution of amphibians, giant floating creatures somewhat like the modern dolphins, but with webbed limbs and lantern-like foreheads. This lantern was the pineal gland. Protruding from the top, it still holds in some reptiles, such as the lizard-like Tuatara species from New Zealand. The lantern was still these proto-human creatures' main organ of perception, sensitive to warmth and coolness in other living beings, both in the vicinity and in the distance. The lantern could intuit their inner nature. These proto-humans could intuit, too, the nature of plants, assessing their suitability as food or medicine, in the way that some animals can. And because of the laws of natural growth were not yet completely fixed, humans could also speak to plants in a way which might, as the ancient sagas of the Jews have it, make a tree yield fruit or ears of wheat grow as tall as the cedars of Lebanon. We must imagine the speech made by these amphibian humans as sounding something like the bellow of a stag. Lantern-headed humans were later idealized as unicorns. Y'all know I love me some unicorns. Check the background. Hint, hint. The earth goddess still told them what to do clairvoyantly, so that the natural law and the moral law were the same thing. This historical truth is beautifully portrayed in the famous tapestry in the Musée de Cluny in Paris, where the unicorn lays its head in the top of a virgin. Our collective memory of the unicorn is, of course, of a hunted creature. Humans might seek sanctuary in the lap of Mother Earth, but the world was becoming a dangerous place. We saw that desire had originally existed independently of humankind, and desires continued to exist independently, integrated onto the proto-human form. These desires, running wild, were the dragons of mythology. They terrorized the rest of creation. As the marshy surface of the earth began to harden into something like dry land, the next stage of development of human form began. This was the beginning of the age of Capricorn, when proto-humans developed calves and limbs to crawl on to land to pursue their burgeoning animal desires. According to the ancient wisdom, it was the arrival of Mars that led to the evolution of warm-blooded animals. Mars arrived at the time of the transition from the lizard-like amphibians of the age of Capricorn to the land animals of the age of four-footed Sagittarius. I'm a Sagittarius. The iron of Mars yielded red blood and provided the conditions that would make egotism possible, and not only in the sense of a healthy drive to survive. As the earth continued to harden and become denser and drier, it shrank further, with the result that one being could only prosper at another's expense. It became part of the human condition that I can hardly move without harming, even killing, another living creature. Because of Mars, there is also a cruel part of human nature that rejoices in this, exults in forcing a fellow human being to submit, and experiences euphoria when it is dominated over others, when it is able to exercise willpower without restraint. As proto-humans became holy land creatures, it also became necessary to create new ways for humans to communicate. It was as the result of the influence of Mercury that the thorax evolved. Mercury also fashioned leaner and fitter limbs, the better for humans to move towards each other and live and work together. He was, of course, the messenger and scribe of the gods, known as Hermes to the Greeks and Thoth to the Egyptians. He was also the god of tricks and thieving. This chapter has been a commentary on Genesis, taking into account parallel traditions, such as the Egyptian and the Greek. This was the interpreting or decoding the Bible surfaced among the Neoplatonists and early Kabbalists, and was elucidated by groups like the Rosicrucians. Much of what we have been considering can be found, for example, in the 17th century writings of Robert Flood, highly influential on Milton's Paradise Lost, and slightly later Jacob Boehme's commentary on Genesis already mentioned. Mysterious Magnum, the work of elucidating these commentaries and reframing the wisdom of the Rosicrucians in modern time, was carried out by the great Austrian scholar and initiate Rudolf Steiner, whose Anthroposophical Society perhaps has a very clear claim to be a conduit of the true Rosicrucian stream. Even outside the esoteric tradition, it is acknowledged that the ancient civilization around the world showed remarkable agreement when it came to the images associated with the sequence of the constellations of the zodiac. This agreement is all the more remarkable when you consider how little the arrangements of the stars as seen from the surface of the earth suggest these images. The reality is that the ancients saw in the sequence of the constellations the history of the evolution of humanity in the world as it was collectively remembered and understood. For them, the history of the world was written in the stars. Then there's some pictures, zodiacs from Egypt, India, and Greece, showing an extraordinary similarity of imagery. Okay, so everybody drawing the zodiacs. Pretty much. Therefore, what is generally regarded as a modern idea that paid to ancient superstition is in fact an ancient idea itself. An understanding of the ordered evolution of the species originated thousands of years before Darwin set sail in HMS Beagle This secret history was encoded in the imagery of the zodiac, written down by the initiates such as Jacob Boehme and Robert Flood, and preserved and carried into modern times by esoteric groups, but always and very deliberately in a way that was hard for outsiders to understand. This is the 19th century, when the sacred texts of Hinduism were first translated into European languages. Much esoteric knowledge which had previously been carefully managed and controlled now leaked into the public consciousness. Fascination with these ideas led to a renewed interest in the Kabbalah and other Western traditions, and helped fire the craze for spiritualism. Many of the great intellectuals of the period became interested in trying to apply scientific methodology to spiritual and spiritualist phenomena. In 1874, Charles Darwin attempted seances with the novelist George Eliot. Darwin's rival A.E. Wallace took part in several controlled experiments into spiritualism, believing its phenomena could be measured and verified just as well as other types of phenomena were. As we shall see later, many leading intellectuals, including scientists, believed that there was something in esoteric philosophy and that science and supernatural would eventually come together. Friedrich Max Müller was a young German scholar employed by the East India Company in the 1840s to translate the Rig Veda. Before being awarded a professional chair at Oxford, he went on to esoteric doctrines widely available for the first time. He was also very friendly with Darwin, with whom he kept up a regular correspondence. The Origin of Species was published in 1859. In The Secret History, the evolution of the species was not the even progress that science supposes. There were twists and turns that have important implications for the way we understand our own philosophy and mental makeup. There were dead ends, false starts, and even deliberate attempts at sabotage. According to the secret doctrine, animals evolved into the forms we are familiar with today, influenced by the stars and planets. Lions by the constellation of Leo, for instance, bulls by the constellation of Taurus. The cosmic plan was that all the world's biological forms would gradually be incorporated into humankind, which was intended to be the crown of all creation. As the gods led humanity closer and closer to human anatomy as we know it, they assumed the part animal, part human forms remembered by the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Persians, and the Babylonians, until they finally assumed anatomically perfect forms remembered by the last great civilizations of the ancient world, the Greeks and Romans. For example, the goddess of the planet Venus was cow-headed Hathor, and the god of the planet Mercury was dog-headed Anubis on the walls of Egyptian temples. According to the secret tradition, these same gods, the same living beings, were remembered by the classical Greeks in a later, more involved form. The ancient texts describing this era also laid great emphasis on giants. The author of the Book of Enoch, writing in the Hebrew tradition, and Plato, writing in the Greek tradition, agree that in these early pre-flood times there arose a race of giants. In fact, traditions of an Diluvian race of giants can be found all over the world, from the Danavas and Daityas of India to the Meots of China. In a dialogue between Midas the and Silenius that has survived in fragmentary from the time of Alexander the Great, Silenus says that men grew to double the size of the tallest men in his time, and they lived to twice the age. In secret tradition, the gigantic Bamiyan statues recently destroyed in Afghanistan were not three giant statues of Buddhas, but three life-size statues of giants of 1731 to 173, 120, and 30 feet high. The drapery that made them look like Buddhas was made of plaster, said to have been added to the stone later. In the 19th century, it was recorded that the locals believed them to be statues of Meots, the giants of Chinese tradition. The famous statues of Easter Island are also supposed to record the real heights of historical giants. Snakes, spiders, beetles, and parasite creatures were formed under the malignant influence of dark side of the moon. Then there were the dead end freaks, the one-legged men, the bat men, the insect men, and the men with tails. Menethian, Egypt, historian of the 3rd century BC, also recorded traditions of the progeny of the Watchers, writing they brought double-winged human beings, also others with 4 wings and 2 faces, human beings with 1 body and 2 heads. Still other human beings had thighs of goats and horns upon their heads. Other had the feet of horses behind and men in front. There were also others said to have been man-headed bulls and four-headed dogs, whose tails emerged like fish tails from their backs, and other monsters such as all kinds of dragon-like beings. This, then, is the era remembered in the great myths and finds echoes in great fantasy literature, such as J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, or the Narnia books of C.S. Lewis. This fantasy literature represents a welling up into the present of a collective memory of this period, when humans lived on the earth with giants, dragons, mermaids, centaurs, unicorns, fauns, satyrs, legions of dwarfs, sylphs, nymphs, dryads, and other lesser spiritual beings served the gods, and humans rubbed shoulders with them, fought battles with them, and sometimes fell in love with them. In the secret history, the last creatures to incarnate before humans were the apes. They came about because some human spirits rushed into incarnation too early, before human anatomy was perfected. In the secret history, therefore, it is not right to say that humans are descended from apes. Rather, that apes represent a degeneration of humankind. Of course, no fabulous creatures have left any trace in the fossil record, so why have men and women of history, initiates of the secret societies, believed in them? Why should any intelligent person even begin to toy with the idea? And that is the end of chapter 5. Next time we read The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth on Adult Bedtime Stories. We will be reading chapter 6, The
Assassination of the Green King.
Please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button if you're loving Secret History of the World. Comment below to let me know your thoughts. Ring that notification bell so that you are notified when I upload, so that you don't miss any chapters or videos in between. Thank you so much, my loves. Let's take another hit for the homies. Thank you so much, loves. Sweet dreams.